The 1970s didn't just make apocalyptic films, they weaponized them. While Hollywood was busy selling sunshine and sequels, a rogue generation of filmmakers was detonating something far more dangerous. Movies that didn't just scare you, they restructured how you thought about civilization, survival, and the terrifying fragility of everything you called normal. These weren't popcorn flicks, they were philosophical grenades. A Boy and His Dog before Mad Max made the wasteland cool, before The Road made it poetic, a scrappy, deeply strange film called A Boy and His Dog crawled out of the American Southwest and rewired what post-apocalyptic storytelling was even supposed to do. This is not a film that holds your hand. It grabs you by the collar, drags you through radioactive rubble, and laughs at you the whole way down. Based on Harlan Ellison's novella, the film drops you into 2024, yes, our 2024, a world blasted apart by World War IV, where roving gangs fight over scraps and a young drifter named Vic wanders the wasteland with his telepathic dog. Blood, let that settle in. A telepathic dog. And somehow, that's not even the weirdest part of this movie. The film was directed by L.Q. Jones, a character actor who had never directed a feature before and reportedly mortgaged everything he owned to get it made. Shot in the Mojave Desert for roughly $400,000, it looked like the end of the world. Because, creatively speaking, the production nearly was won. Actors were paid almost nothing. Equipment broke constantly. The crew was skeletal. But what emerged was something genuinely dangerous. Below the surface, the film functions as a brutal satire of American masculine entitlement. Vic isn't a hero. He's selfish, short-sighted, and driven almost entirely by base impulses. The underground society he eventually encounters, a pastel-colored. White picket nightmare called Topeka is a savage parody of 1950s suburban conformity, complete with clown-faced administrators and enforced cheerfulness. Critics at the time were divided. Some called it juvenile. Others, particularly within the science fiction community, recognized it as a masterpiece of tonal inversion. Roger Ebert gave it a mixed review, but acknowledged its savage wit. Harlan Ellison himself famously hated the ending, going on record to call it a sophomoric betrayal of the source material. The ending, if you haven't seen it, involves a moral choice so coldly nihilistic that audiences in 1975 reportedly sat in stunned silence before either laughing nervously or walking out entirely. The film grossed modestly at the box office, but achieved legendary cult status through midnight screenings and home video. It was the kind of movie that circulated among people who wanted to feel like they'd seen something others hadn't, and in 1975, they had. Soylent Green there is a twist in Soylent Green so culturally embedded, so thoroughly repeated and parodied, that most people who have never seen the film already know it. And yet, watching the movie actually deliver that revelation still hits like a freight train, because director Richard Fleischer constructed everything around it with the precision of a man who knew exactly what kind bomb he was building. Set in 2022, again, a year we've now lived through, the film imagines New York City as a sweltering, overcrowded catastrophe. 40 million people crammed into broken infrastructure, eating processed food rations distributed by the all-powerful Soylent Corporation. The city sweats, it groans, it barely breathes. And then a murder investigation led by Detective Thorne, played by Charlton Heston, begins pulling on a thread that unravels everything. What makes Soylent Green genuinely apocalyptic isn't just its scenario, it's how lived in the decay feels. The production design is extraordinary for its budget. Families sleep on staircases, riot police use garbage scoops to shovel protesters into trucks. Edward G. Robinson, in his final screen appearance, he died 12 days after filming wrapped and knew he was dying throughout production, brings a heartbreaking gravitas to the film's emotional core. Robinson's death scene is one of cinema's most quietly devastating moments. His character, Sol Roth, chooses a peaceful, voluntary death at a government facility, surrounded by screens showing footage of the world as it once was, green fields, oceans, animals, sunlight, Robinson was watching real footage of a world he himself was about to leave. Heston reportedly wept genuinely during filming. The film was based on Harry Harrison's 1966 novel Make Room. Make Room, though Harrison publicly noted that the book's actual message was about overpopulation and resource scarcity rather than the film's more sensational climax. The movie's message landed harder, though. It grossed over $17 million against a budget of around $4 million and sparked real conversations about corporate food control, ecological collapse, and the ethics of what we consume. Critics praised Heston's performance and the film's oppressive atmosphere, though some felt the detective story structure was too conventional for the ideas it was carrying. In hindsight, they were wrong. The convention is precisely what made the horror land. You think you're watching a thriller. And then, the world ends. The Omega Man before Will Smith jogged through an empty New York in I Am Legend. Before every prestige streaming show made the deserted city its aesthetic calling card, Charlton Heston was already driving a convertible through a depopulated Los Angeles, blasting mutants with an automatic rifle, and somehow making the apocalypse look like the loneliest, most glamorous nightmare imaginable. The Omega Man is adapted from Richard Matheson's landmark novel I Am Legend, and it is, let's be direct, a very 1971 adaptation of that novel. It doesn't have the existential purity of the book. What it has instead is something arguably more interesting as a cultural artifact. It is a film completely saturated with its own era's anxieties. Draped in mod fashion, scored with electric funk, and starring one of Hollywood's most politically charged actors at the height of his complicated reputation. Robert Neville, played by Heston, is the last immune man in a world wiped out by biological warfare between the United States and the Soviet Union. Everyone else has been transformed into the family, photophobic, albino zealots who wear robes, smash technology, and represent, fairly explicitly, a counterculture gone apocalyptic. The subtext practically screams. These are the hippies, the anti-science radicals, the people who would burn down civilization in the name of purity. Director Boris Sagal constructed the film with a strange, dreamlike quality. Heston walks through department stores, talks to mannequins, runs film reels of Woodstock, and drinks alone in his fortified penthouse. It is both ridiculous and deeply melancholy. His isolation is portrayed with a specificity that transcends the B-movie trappings. The film made $34 million globally and proved that apocalyptic storytelling had genuine box office muscle. But what critics mostly missed at the time, and what scholars have since written extensively about, was the film's surprisingly progressive racial politics for a 1971 Hollywood production. The survivors Neville eventually finds include a black woman in a leadership role, and their dynamic was written with a seriousness that was genuinely unusual for the period. Anthony Zerbe's performance as Matthias, the family's leader, is operatically brilliant. He chews scenery with such committed menace that the film frequently becomes his movie rather than Heston's. The Omega Man is messy, dated, and absolutely essential. Zardoz John Borman spent his own money to make Zardoz. He raised a significant portion of the budget himself after Warner Bros. Gave him creative freedom following the enormous success of Deliverance, and what he delivered was, there is simply no other word for it, unhinged. A flying stone head that vomits guns over a wasteland population, while intoning that the gun is good and the penis is evil. Sean Connery, in an orange nappy and thigh-high boots, an immortal intellectual class slowly dying of boredom while the brutish exterior world bleeds. This film is either a work of visionary genius or a spectacular ego catastrophe. After nearly 50 years, audiences still haven't agreed on which. Set in the year 2293, Zardoz imagines a post-apocalyptic Earth divided between the Eternals, a class of immortal, intellectually superior humans living in a protected zone called the Vortex, and the Brutals, the barbaric exterior population kept in check by the Exterminators, who worship the floating stone idol called Zardoz. Sean Connery plays Zed, an exterminator who smuggles himself inside the stone head and arrives in the vortex to turn everything upside down. Borman wrote the script in a fever. He has described it as emerging from an almost unconscious place, drawing on Arthurian mythology, theosophy, and the cultural convulsions of the early 1970s. The result is a film that operates more like a fever dream than a narrative. Logic is optional. Symbolism is everywhere. Charlotte Rampling delivers a performance of coiled, sardonic intelligence that frequently outshines the film around her. Critics in 1974 were savage. Pauline Kael called it an orgy of ineptitude. The film bombed commercially. Connery, fresh off his final official Bond appearance in Diamonds Are Forever, seemed to be actively dismantling his own image, which was either brave or bewildering depending on your perspective. But Zardoz has undergone a remarkable critical rehabilitation. Film scholars now read it as a sophisticated, if chaotic, interrogation of class, mortality, intellectualism, and the self-destructive tendencies of utopian thinking. The film argues, essentially, that immortality without purpose is the true apocalypse, that civilization can die not with a bang, but with infinite, comfortable stagnation. The visual design is extraordinary. The vortex sequences have an eerie, watercolor beauty completely at odds with the wasteland exterior. Borman was working from pure instinct, and it shows in both the film's failures and its most genuinely stunning moments. No Blade of Grass, almost nobody talks about No Blade of Grass. That is a cultural crime, because this British film, directed by Cornell Wilde and released at the very dawn of the 1970s, went places that mainstream American cinema wouldn't dare approach for another decade, and it did so with a raw, almost documentary brutality that left audiences in the United Kingdom profoundly disturbed. The premise is ecological horror, rendered at its most visceral. A mutant virus has destroyed all grass, grain, and cereal crops across Asia. Famine is spreading. The British government, in secret, plans to bomb its own industrial cities to reduce the population load. A family, upper middle class, comfortable, completely unprepared, flees London for a remote farm in Scotland owned by relatives. The journey destroys them, piece by piece, and not just physically. Wilde adapted the film from John Christopher's 1956 novel, The Death of Grass, and pushed it significantly further into moral darkness than the source material required. Characters commit acts of violence that are presented without catharsis or redemption. The family recruits a former soldier and his biker gang for protection. The bikers bring with them a casual, horrifying violence that the family first condemns, then tolerates, and finally adopts. By the film's end, the protagonists have become something unrecognizable. MGM, which distributed the film, was reportedly alarmed by the content and added a disclaimer at the beginning warning audiences about the film's disturbing nature, which, naturally, made more people want to see it. It was rated X in the United Kingdom, not for any specific scene, but for the cumulative psychological impact of its violence and moral collapse. Critics were sharply divided. Some praised its ecological prescience. This was 1970, well before environmentalism entered the mainstream conversation, and its unflinching look at how quickly civilization dissolves under genuine pressure. Others found it exploitative and nihilistic. What makes No Blade of Grass quietly prophetic is its understanding that the apocalypse isn't a single moment. It's a gradient. The film tracks the precise, incremental points at which its characters surrender their values, and it never lets them, or the audience, feel comfortable about any of it. The Ultimate Warrior. Here is a film that deserves a full cultural resurrection and has somehow never received one. The Ultimate Warrior was written and directed by Robert Klaus, the man behind Enter the Dragon, and it stars Yul Brynner and Max von Sydow in a post-plague New York City that feels so specifically detailed, so grimly plausible, that it functions almost as urban planning horror. Set in the unspecified near future, the film imagines New York as a collection of fortified urban tribes surviving after a plague has wiped out most of civilization. Max von Sydow leads one such community, a small, garden-growing enclave with seeds developed by a scientist that could restart agricultural civilization. Yul Brynner plays Carson, a mercenary warrior hired to protect the community and eventually to transport those seeds, and a pregnant woman carrying the future out of the city. The film's geography is fascinating. Klaus shot extensively on location in New York during the city's most economically desperate period, and the decay of the environment around the actors is entirely real. The burned-out buildings, the abandoned lots, the broken infrastructure, none of it is set design. The apocalypse is the actual 1975 New York City, just slightly extended forward in imagination. Brynner is magnetic in a way that he rarely got credit for in this period of his career. He says almost nothing throughout the film. Carson is defined entirely by physical economy and moral clarity, and the performance has a stoic grace that recalls his iconic work in The Magnificent Seven, transposed into something far bleaker. Critics at the time gave it decent reviews, but treated it as minor genre entertainment. The film made modest money and disappeared fairly quickly from mainstream conversation. That disappearance is genuinely baffling. Because The Ultimate Warrior is doing something quite sophisticated, it's arguing that in the true aftermath of civilization, the most valuable currency isn't strength or weaponry, but biological knowledge. Seeds, specifically, the future literally lives in a clay pot. Von Sydow brings enormous gravitas to what could have been a functional role, investing the community leader with exhaustion and wisdom in equal measure. His scenes with Brynner carry a generational weight that elevates the entire film. Punishment Park Peter Watkins was already considered one of the most dangerous filmmakers in British television when he made Punishment Park. After the BB banned his docudrama The War Game in 1965, a dramatized documentary about nuclear war so realistic that the government considered it a national security concern, Watkins moved to America and made something that the American government probably would have banned if anyone had been paying close enough attention. Punishment Park is presented entirely as documentary footage captured by a European film crew. It depicts a near-future America where the Nixon administration has invoked the McCarran Internal Security Act to detain political dissidents without trial. Groups of young activists, anti-war protesters, Black Power advocates, feminists are given a choice: accept their prison sentences or compete in Punishment Park, a 3-day ordeal in the Mojave Desert where they must reach an American flag across 53 miles while being pursued by law enforcement trainees. The film was shot with non-professional actors, many of whom were actual political activists. The arguments in the tribunal scenes, where detainees face a panel of citizens, were largely improvised from real political positions held by the participants. The result is a film that frequently stops feeling like fiction altogether. Watkins has described the shoot as genuinely confrontational. Tensions between the actors playing law enforcement and those playing detainees became real. Improvised arguments turned heated. Some participants walked off set. The desert heat added a physical desperation to the performances that no direction could have manufactured. The film received virtually no theatrical release in the United States. Critics who saw it were either electrified or horrified. Roger Ebert, in a rare contemporary review, called it one of the most powerful and important political films ever made. Others accused Watkins of propaganda so transparent it undermined its own case. The apocalypse in Punishment Park isn't nuclear or ecological, it's institutional. It's the moment when the machinery of democratic law becomes the machinery of authoritarian control, and nobody notices because the paperwork is all in order. That is the film's most chilling argument, and it is aged with devastating precision. Quintet Robert Altman made Quintet at the absolute peak of his creative and commercial credibility, with the freedom to do virtually anything, and what he chose to do was make the most alienating, deliberately opaque. ice-cold apocalyptic film in Hollywood history. Audiences despised it. Critics were baffled. It earned back a fraction of its budget, and Altman later said it was one of his favorite films he ever made. Set in a future ice age that is slowly extinguishing what remains of humanity, Quintet follows Essex, played by Paul Newman, arriving at a crumbling, freezing city where the only remaining entertainment and the only remaining social organization is a board game called Quintet, in which players eliminate each other until one remains. Someone has taken the game off the board. The eliminations are now real, and Essex, whose pregnant companion is killed in the opening act, is drawn into the murderous tournament. Altman filmed in Montreal during one of its most brutal winters. He deliberately smeared the edges of every frame with petroleum jelly, creating a blurred, frozen dreamscape effect that initially alienated cinematographers who heard about it and confused audiences who experienced it. The film looks like it is being viewed through frosted glass. The effect is incredibly intentional. Clarity, Altman argued, was itself a kind of deception. The end of the world should not be crisply focused. Paul Newman was deeply committed to the project and reportedly found the experience among the most creatively fulfilling of his career, which makes the film's reception all the more painful. He gave an interview where he described Quintet as genuinely misunderstood and said he believed it would eventually be recognized for what it was. He wasn't wrong. Academic attention to Quintet has grown significantly since the 1990s, with scholars analyzing its use of game theory as metaphor for social competition, its treatment of nihilism versus will to survive, and its extraordinary commitment to aesthetic discomfort as a storytelling tool. The film argues something genuinely devastating, that when civilization reaches its final chapter, human beings won't weep for what they've lost. They'll invent a game. They'll keep score. They'll eliminate each other according to rules they invented themselves and call it meaning. Damnation Alley, Damnation Alley was supposed to be 20th Century Fox's biggest film of 1977. The studio had invested heavily in it. They had a major effects budget, a strong cast including Jan Michael Vincent, George Peppard, and Dominique Sanda, and a source novel by Roger Zelazny that was genuinely beloved in science fiction circles. They planned for it to be their apocalyptic event film of the year. Then Star Wars happened. Fox released Star Wars the same year. Every resource, every marketing dollar, every piece of promotional real estate the studio had was immediately redirected toward the film that was quietly becoming a cultural earthquake. Damnation Alley got pushed to the margins and released into theaters that were already saturated with Jedi mythology and impossible expectations. The result was that one of the most visually ambitious apocalyptic films of the decade was seen by almost nobody who wasn't already a science fiction enthusiast, and it vanished so quickly from screens that its reputation calcified almost immediately into the failure Fox made instead of focusing on Star Wars. That reputation is both understandable and profoundly unfair. Damnation Alley follows a group of survivors crossing a post-nuclear America in a massive, heavily armored vehicle called the Landmaster, which was a fully functional, custom-built machine that remains one of the most extraordinary practical vehicles ever constructed for a film production. The Landmaster was real. It drove. It worked. It cost a fortune, and it is magnificent. The landscape they cross is genuinely hallucinatory. Zelazny's novel imagined post-nuclear America as a place of savage, mutated beauty, colored storm systems, mutant wildlife, barbaric survivor communities, and the film captures much of this with practical effects that, while occasionally limited by 1977 technology, frequently achieve a genuine alien grandeur. Director Jack Smite didn't make a masterpiece, but he made something vivid, strange, and completely sincere, and the film's quiet cult following, sustained through cable television reruns and later home video, is one of the more poignant stories in genre cinema. The fans of Damnation Alley feel a particular loyalty to it. the kind of loyalty you develop for something you rescued from unfair obscurity. The apocalypse in this film is crossed rather than survived. The horizon is always the goal. And there is something quietly hopeful in that, even if Hollywood's own apocalyptic timing buried it before it had a chance. So which of these films broke your brain? Drop it in the comments, and be specific, because they were all great is the most boring answer in cinema. Here's the real question to argue about. The 1970s gave us apocalyptic films that were genuinely furious at society, at government, corporations, human nature itself. Today's apocalyptic movies mostly just want you to root for the survivor. Did we trade genuine cinematic rage for spectacle? And was that trade worth it?